Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Welcome back to your favorite podcast, Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. I'm your genial host, the one and only Dennis Rimmer. Today we're talking once again with Amy Jo Eamon. We had her on a while ago, and that was wonderful, and now she's back. And just as an introduction, Amy Jo Eamon, an award-winning author and journalist. Previous books include Out of Old Saskatchewan Kitchens and Prairie Feast, A Writer's Journey Home for Dinner, as well as the pictorial history of Saskatoon. So before we get into the new book, which is called Thelma, A Life in Pictures, Amy Jo, what did a sensible person like you from a great farm background, how'd you ever end up in the crazy world of journalism?
Well, I guess looking back on my youth, when I was a teenager, I wanted to be a journalist. So I had my mind set on that from a very early age. And I guess if I was really going to think about it even more deeply, I think it's because I had a great social studies teacher in high school. And I remember being interested in the news and world events. So that's where that started.
And it seems like I've talked to a lot of people who knew, unfortunately I was not one of them because I'm still floundering, but knew around the age of 12 or 13 what exactly they wanted to do with their lives. So does that kind of fall into place in your story as well?
I guess so. I had kind of grander schemes that I was going to be a foreign correspondent and travel all over the world. And I don't know, I guess I grew up and realized that was a lot of work. And maybe I just wasn't quite cut out for that. But I really enjoyed my career, the bulk of it, which was at CBC Radio and Television, and before that at the Star Phoenix. So as I started adulting, let's say, I followed a more realistic path, but still generally in the direction that I had intended to from my early teenage years.
I know what you're saying, and the latest book is called Thelma. It's A Life in Pictures. Now, it's the basic who, what, where, when, and why of this one. Like Thelma, A Life in Pictures, of course, a double meaning in the title because it's about Thelma and her life in pictures, but also her life in pictures. So tell us, who is Thelma and why a book about her?
Thelma Pepper. Thelma Pepper is a photographer living in Saskatoon who has had a claim for her photos, her art photos. She had shows at the Mendel Art Gallery back when it was still with us here in the city of Saskatoon, and is actually going to have a pretty large retrospective of her work in the new year at our new Remy Modern Gallery, which will definitely be worth a look. So Thelma is a photographer of some renown who is, at the moment, 100 years old. So she has lived a long and rich life growing up in Nova Scotia. She was a little girl in Nova Scotia. Her father and grandfather were both amateur photographers, but by amateur they took the most beautiful photographs of another time. Unlike, we think of so many of our old photographs where people are sitting there without smiling or they're blurry. They took beautiful photographs, which I was able to use in telling her story. So there's the part, as you mentioned, the double meaning to her life in pictures, because she has been in pictures since she was a very little girl. But the thing is that she grew up in the darkroom. Her dad developed all his pictures, and Thelma was his helper from a very early age. By the time she was a teenager, she was proficient in the darkroom. She went off to university. She studied science, so that's her background, biology, a master's in science, at a time when it was a little unusual for women to study science. And she married a man who became a university professor at the University of Saskatchewan. So that's how she ended up in Saskatoon. And her husband, Jim, became head of the chemistry department. He's quite successful at the university. And Thelma devoted her life as a wife and a mother, she didn't have a career outside the home in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Well, she was a young wife and her children were growing up. But at that point in her life, when her youngest moved away from home off for university, she was around 60, 59, 60. She really suffered a crisis of self, and she entered a period of depression. She just wasn't sure, what was her purpose now? What was she supposed to do with herself? It felt to her like everyone, including her husband and her children, were pursuing the dreams of their life, and she had nothing of her own at that point. And she started looking for activities, trying different things, trying to get her out of this funk and to find something that would make her feel good and find a place in this world. And at the age of 60, she picked up the camera and she started taking photos. At the beginning, it was the seniors who lived in the seniors' home quite near where she lived here in Saskatoon. And they were just stunning photos. And she took them home. She had a darkroom in her home, and she developed them, and they're just beautiful photos. And although in the beginning she was only taking them because she loved to take the pictures and develop them and then give them to people so they could see these beautiful photos that she was taking of them, but others recognized in those photos a really singular eye, a really beautiful perspective, how she captured the spirit and the life of these people just by taking portraits of them, candid portraits. And so she had early attention with these photos and some shows here in the city, and that really launched her onto a 3-decade career as primarily as a portrait photographer here in Saskatoon and in rural Saskatchewan.
And the book is Thelma, A Life in Pictures, put together by Amy Jo Eamon. How did you come in contact with Thelma?
I guess it was a couple years ago. So Thelma was the subject of a documentary that aired on CBC Radio a couple years ago on the Sunday morning program. And my publisher, who lives in Nova Scotia, heard it. And because he just instantly, fell in love with the idea of Thelma, listening to her voice and listening to her story on the video. And he phoned me up. And because she was born in Nova Scotia, but she lived in Saskatoon, he phoned me up and said, Amy, we have to do a book about this lady. I want to do this so bad. So at the time, I knew that Thelma was quite old. She was a senior woman. I think she was 98 at the time. I didn't have a clue whether she was going to be interested in having a book about her life at all. I didn't know really about her father and grandfather being photographers. And so I just kind of made an inquiry out, through a friend of a friend who knew someone in the family, basically. And the word came back to me that they would love to entertain this idea. They would love to have a book of her pictures and even tell her story, because there are certain themes in her life. Thelma thinks a lot about the things that really influenced her life. And given that she's 100 and she's, I'm going to say, she's got a better memory than me. She often thinks back on her life and writes little stories for herself and her family. And the idea of compiling these into a book that was broadly appealing, that spoke to people beyond her own family, that really appealed to them. So we got together and discussed it, and we decided we were going to do it. So here it is, finally in the world.
But that seems to be, it came together quite quickly then. If she's 100, she just turned 100 this summer, and that was when she was 98. And in the book world, coming out with something in less than 2 years seems like a rather rapid progress. Is that what it seemed like to you?
Oh, man, yes, you've got it. Oh, Dennis, Well, we decided to do it as quickly as possible. I put a lot of dedicated time into it, because it generally does take 2 years for a book to come out, and we super compressed it. And there were a couple of things that made that possible and made that relevant. One of the things is that this book is so heavy on pictures that it's not really heavy on prose. There's a definite, I wrote a story, the story progresses a little bit on every page, but every page has also got a picture or an artifact or something from Thelma's life, so that it's not text heavy. It's not a book where you read a whole chapter and then look at a couple pictures. Every page you're looking at a picture and reading a small bit of text. So by keeping the text really pithy, really short, it helped bring down the time that it was going to take to write the whole thing. But the other thing that was quite an imperative for us is that, which I didn't know when we first started, and then I found out, is that Remy Martin was planning this retrospective of Thelma's photographs, and they wanted to do it in 2020, this year they wanted to do it. And we thought, wouldn't it be great to time it, right? So it can be in the gallery bookstore at the same time that her show comes out. Now, the show did not happen in 2020 because of this COVID pandemic lockdown. It has been pushed forward to 2021 in February. But I guess, just the opportunity to time a book for an event like that was just too good of an opportunity not to coordinate with. So we made it happen. We made it happen in a year. I tell you, when we got down to the end, when we were doing page proofs and page design and off to the printer, it was a crunch. It was a real crunch time. It was long days, but we got it done.
And it's great. It's called Thelma, A Life in Pictures. I'll say compiled by Amy Jo Eamon, although I know you had lots to do with the writing. And as we were talking, I just opened the book to page 91. And it looks like, at first glance, a rather stark, black and white, bleak prairie image, and this is what the text is. When Thelma showed this image to a class of biology students at the university during a talk on nature photography, she referred to it as a lonely place. One of the students raised his hand and corrected her. He said, "That's not a lonely place, it's the best place in the world. That's where I come from." So the stories resonate for 100 years through these pictures and through the words and images from you and from Thelma.
Absolutely. Thelma was really fascinated with the landscape and also with small towns and people whose original family backgrounds were from different cultures. When their families settled on the land, how they all got together, and then when she was taking photos in the 80s and 90s, how many of these towns were disappearing, but the people who still lived there were strongly involved in their community and very proud of their community. Thelma did a whole photographic exhibition. She called it Highway 41, and it was just her travels up and down the highway from Saskatoon to Melfort and the little communities in there. And she took a lot of photos that just portrayed the landscape that she was finding there. And these are often panoramic photos. The thing that you'll notice on that photo is that she didn't have a panoramic camera, right, that would take like one long photo on the horizon, but she would take pictures and one at a time and move her camera and then put them together in the darkroom so that you can see variations from picture to picture. Sometimes the horizon line, she tried to keep the horizon line steady, but sometimes there's little variations in color because, of course, the sky is always changing. And if you're taking pictures over the course of 20 minutes, say, it's going to change on you. So part of her love of photography was going in the darkroom and developing each individual picture them together to create these really evocative black and white panoramas of the countryside.
And the pictures, all of them black and white? I haven't had a chance to turn every page, but most of them are black and white, I assume. There isn't a color picture in there, is there?
There's no colored pictures in the book at all. Thelma shot in black and white. She had a dark room in her home in Saskatoon, which her father installed for her. And because of her early learning about photography and developing, it was all black and white back in the 20s, 30s, 40s when she was developing photos with her dad. So it was, in a way, going back to her first love of black and white photography.
And it's interesting to note because my wife grew up in a darkroom as well. Her dad was a professional portrait photographer, among other things. Ran the camera department down there at Pinders when it was Pinders on 2nd Avenue in Saskatoon. So yeah, she's one of those photography kids as well, I guess you would say. So I know of what you speak. Thelma, A Life in Pictures, put together by Amy Jo Eamon. And like you said, the publishers from Nova Scotia, the subject, Thelma, lives in Saskatoon. So I'm assuming this book has nationwide distribution, to say the least.
Absolutely. That will be our goal now that the book is out into the world. The publisher as a marketing agent and a marketing and promotions agent who's working on that. That was a mouthful, to get the book out there. So yeah, that is our hope. Of course, it's kind of odd introducing a book in these sort of strange times when a lot of us are sort of locked into our own little bubbles. But on the other hand, there's other opportunities. Now everyone is experimenting with Zoom events, and the bookstore here in Saskatoon, McNally Robinson, is organizing book launches on its Zoom platform. And what these digital platforms allow us to do is promote the book to a broader audience. So even though I'm here in Saskatoon, normally I'd be having events in Saskatchewan in person, but having them online on Zoom is actually an opportunity to bring it to the world. So I'm actually quite excited about being able to do things like that. So I hope there's more of that as the word about the book spreads and we get more attention towards it.
And it's sort of like the whole nation, at least, is populated with folks from the what do you call it? Just a sec, there we go. The Saskatchewan diaspora, as it were. People of, like in the 20s, Saskatchewan had well over 1 million people, and then it dropped down and now climbing back up. So there's people with Saskatchewan roots, shall we say, all over the country. So this should be of interest to folks near and far, wouldn't you say?
I sure hope so. And also folks from Nova Scotia who are near and far, because they're going to see a lot of their home territory in there as well. And there's other themes of the book that, even if you're not from Saskatchewan or Nova Scotia, there's themes of mental health, of well-being. Thelma's overwhelming message in her story is following your passions, because it was following her passion that allowed her to lift herself out of this depression that she was feeling at the age of 59, 60 and take her down this other pathway of photography. And so she just so believes in following our creative instincts and digging deep to find that spirit in us that makes us feel good about what we're doing and makes us feel like sharing it with others. That's such a strong theme in Thelma's life.
And the book is Thelma, A Life in Pictures, and the photo cover that must be Thelma at a young age, right? Or is that you? No.
No, Thelma, is that not such a beautiful picture? It's Thelma, I'm going to say like around 8, 9 years old, reading a book, and that's her father's picture of her. So it's such an evocative picture that the publisher picked it for the cover, but it's so appropriate because reading was such an important thing to Thelma. She believed in the power of reading. She read books out loud to her children, even when they were old enough to read to themselves. She just felt reading was such an important activity in a family. And it was actually reading that took her to the seniors' home. She was reading out loud to seniors. And that's where she started taking her pictures. It was reading that took her there in the first place. So it's really safe and true to say that reading changed her life. So having a picture of Thelma reading a book on the cover not only shows sort of the atmosphere, the photographic atmosphere in which she grew up, but how important the act of reading was throughout her whole life. And even today, I went over there the other day to visit with her. Now she's allowed to have visitors only outside, only with masks at a 6-foot distance,
right?
Because of the care home that she lives in, right? So we sat outside, thankfully. It's really nice days. And she comes out with her walker. She walks with the walker. Otherwise, I don't have Dritch. She's really quite amazingly able. But the book that she's reading right now is sitting there on her walker. She's reading Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. So this is like a comprehensive history of the world through these themes of conquest of, guns and dominant culture.
I get a kick out of that comment because I put myself to sleep by listening to audiobooks, and that's the one I'm listening to now.
Honestly, goodness, that is amazing. So
Yep.
how comprehensive this book is. But we had a really good discussion about the themes of the book while I was sitting there with her the other day.
Well, again, looking at the cover, it looks to me like almost like she's annoyed that somebody interrupted her when she's trying to do something. She's almost mad, depressed, upset. Like, why are you bothering me? I'm trying to read. That's the thoughts I got from that. Thelma.
That's kind of interesting, yeah.
Thelma, A Life in Pictures, put together by Amy Jo Eamon with Thelma's Pictures, who just turned 100. Why are we so amazed when people at a certain age are able to do things? Like, what is this ageist hatred we have of, or prejudice against, quote-unquote, old people? Wow. You're 900 years old and you can walk? Good for you. Yeah, well, so what?
It's interesting that you bring that up, because when Thelma first started taking pictures of the seniors in the care home near where she lived, she was 60 and they were 85. So they were 25 years older than her. And she started listening to their stories and realizing what rich lives they led. And interesting, they were interested in the world. They were interested in talking about it. They were proud about, raising their families and making them go. Oftentimes they lived on hardscrabble farms. Some of them lost their husbands, and they were single moms at a time when there was no social safety net. And she's talking to these women, years later as seniors, and learning about the hard lives they've lived and how proud and excited and interested they are in the world now. And she thought, you know what? These people deserve to be listened to. Their stories deserve to be heard. Like, we should not think of them as, put into this care home and forgotten. And she actually started taking her tape recorder and recording their stories. And so her photographic exhibition of those senior ladies includes audio material as well. So that will be we'll be able to hear their voices. And sometimes you see a photograph of a woman who looks kind of old and, a little bit shrunken and, withdrawn or something. But then you hear her voice and, it's robust and passionate and full of life. And you just can, imagine how interesting it was to sit with these ladies. And I have experienced that now, sitting for all those hours that I have with Thelma, listening to her telling me her stories. And that is such an important message from her work and from my experience writing this book, is that people of that age are just as interesting and vital and full of life and want to engage with the world as we might be at any other point in our age as we, in our lives. So I hope it inspires other people who read it to sit down with seniors and ask them their stories and take their pictures.
I fully agree. And the next time, my next birthday, if somebody says, "Oh, you look so blankety blank for someone being 70 blank years young," I'm going to bop them in the nose. I just hate that expression. Oh, 70 years young. Ooh, who cares? Thelma, A Life in Pictures by Amy Jo Eamon and Thelma. And what are you working on now? The history of wheat?
Hey, you remembered from our last conversation. Yes,
I'm still waiting.
Finally. I've been working on this history of wheat, as we talked about before, because I grew up on a wheat farm at the town of Craig, Saskatchewan, where my brother and my nephew are farming now. And
yep.
I just, from a very early on, wanted to write a history of wheat, and I just keep putting it off for other things. But now I'm going to do it.
All right. And Thelma, now what's Thelma's last name again?
Thelma Pepper.
There you go. Thelma, A Life in Pictures by Amy Jo Eamon, and all the photos by Thelma, who is 100 years young. you can get the book just about any. Oh, quickly, Amy Jo, your website. What is it again?
My website is my initials and my last name, ajeeman.com. And you'll find a link there on my homepage. My publisher is offering free shipping to anywhere in Canada for this book. So you can find a link there to link through and order it from my publisher if you wish to, without having to pay postage.
That is super. So look it up, everybody. Amy Jo Eman, Thelma, A Life in Pictures at AJEHMAN.com. And when next we talk to you, we will sink our teeth into the history of wheat.
I hope so.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.